Hello everyone, my name is Paul Third, and this week I'm going to give you the proper science around what makes EQ plugins sound the same and also what makes them sound different. There is a video that's going about just now, or a set of videos from a YouTuber called AP Mastering, and basically he's made some videos talking about why all EQ plugins sound the same. I'll kind of go into where he's right, but I'm going to go into where he's kind of wrong and kind of where he's kind of dodging certain things to give you a realistic impression of what actually is the differences between EQ plugins and why certain EQ plugins, like what he's saying, basically do just sound the same and they're fucking pointless, as I've done multiple times and showed you multiple times in the past, but also why there are certain EQ plugins that have a sound and why they do sound different and why they might be worth giving a shot. So let's get into it. Right, so what makes an EQ plugin sound the same from another? Now, this is a very, very, very simple thing to talk about. Dan Worrell's covered a video. See if I could find it and leave a link up here or maybe in the description. And he was basically talking, it was basically a video response to a video I'd made. And it was talking about linearity and non-linearity. And years ago, I got a little bit confused between the two. And then it ended up being a terminology thing. I re-edited the video, and it was basically, long story short, it was like I was looking at acustica green and something else, and there was something in the sampling. And when I was like doing a standard bell or whatever, it wasn't a symmetrical bell, it was all over the shop. Some people have said to me it was incorrectly sampled, but I was like, well, there's something fucking non-linear about that. I was like, what the fuck's going on there? But then I did a video about it and it got very confusing. But Dan did a very good video on it, and essentially what this other guy, this Paul AP Mastering guy on YouTube, is trying to kind of cover as well is that in terms of the filters, right, in terms of your bells, your notches, high pass filters and blah blah, your shelves, they are all ones and zeros and they are all mathematical and they can all null each other because, again, it is ones and zeros. And something that this video did kind of do right was he talked very briefly about an analog circuit and how, I don't know what it is, if it's the transistors or the capacitors that handle the filter sections of analog EQs. That section, in nearly all cases, is completely linear. So it doesn't make any distortion. So what comes in is what comes out. So in regards to many analog emulations, I've covered it a lot on the channel. The Waves RS56, I completely nulled it, fully nulled it. The MAAG EQ, I got inaudible nulls with KIRCHHOFF. Even the Better Maker EQ from Plugin Alliance, I got inaudible nulls. And the main reason I was able to do that was because there wasn't enough non-linearity in the signal. There wasn't enough noise or distortion to be able to create enough audible difference. The only difference is in the filters. And if you get the filters right, because it is all maths and it is all DSP and they are all numerically coded, then you can null them. So where this AP Mastering is correct is that there are many digital EQs out there that don't have any non-linearity or don't have enough non-linearity in there to be able to give you anything different from a stock digital EQ, because all of the filters can be recreated in most cases. And that was the reason why myself and Dan Worrell were able to fucking crash fucking Harrison's whole marketing campaign, because there was no non-linearities in there. It was a completely linear digital EQ. And it's funny how me and Dan, I always find it funny, everybody thinks that Dan's video was first. Mine's was first. It was just that Dan was in the process of making his whilst I was making mine. And I think there was like a 3-day gap. But you put the two of us together, it was game over for Harrison. It was absolutely game over. But, right, however, if we use the Harrison EQ as an example, something that I can't remember, I think I did cover it, but Dan went a little bit more into detail. One thing that we found was that what made the Harrison EQ different from, say, a Pro Q3 or a standard digital, or most standard digital stock EQs, was the EQ cramping. Now, there are certain things in the digital domain that, again, there are limitations to the digital domain. There's videos all about it. We don't need to get into full detail about it. But in terms of EQ cramping, Dan did a great video about it, and he was able to show the difference in the high end and kind of more maybe extreme settings. But there is a difference when you, say, do like a high shelf or a high bell and say Pro Q3 compared to, say, like a high bell with, say, the Harrison EQ. And the main reason that we talked about that was because in analog, you don't get that. There is no EQ cramping in analog. It just reaches the end of the frequency spectrum and that's it. That's it. The converter then lobs the rest off in the A to D. That's it. Easy. So that's just one example where two plugins can sound different. Even though they're both linear digital EQs, there is inherent limitations in one that can make it sound different in a certain circumstance. Now, another limitation of that, which this AP mastering kind of stumbled upon, and by the way, I'm going to just advise to you, mate, delete that out. Delete that bit out when you're talking about the all-pass filter, and I can't remember what it is. Is it the curve bender or something, the soft tube curve bender, I think. And he was like, oh, what, like, have they put an all-pass filter in or something like that? Why would they mess up the phase like that? And he fucking honestly tried to recreate it and tried to recreate the phase and fucking skewed frequency response. He's like, who would ever do that? Who would ever do that? I would never use that in mastering. When really, what he didn't know was that it was an anti-aliasing filter. And I was watching it going, stop it, you fucking make me have a panic attack. Because I'm like, why did you waste your time trying to recreate that when it's an anti-aliasing filter? Now again, I don't need to go into the details of anti-aliasing filters via internal oversampling, because I've talked about it and there's lots of videos on it. Again, everything is in the description. Everything that I've discussed is in the description. But what you need to be aware of is that some plugins will have internal oversampling in there in order to mitigate for EQ cramping. Now, in a lot of cases, especially with UAD's own plugins, like their Motown EQ being a good example of that, to mitigate for EQ cramping, they were using linear phase oversampling, which is essentially an FIR filter. However, why I'm talking about this is because I want to hark back to my good old friends, my good old enemies, Kit plugins. Now, for anybody that doesn't know the story about it, I took the Hitsville EQ and I took their Motown EQ and I fucking tore it apart because I basically found out that their marketing was bullshit and it was a completely linear digital EQ. And I tore it to pieces, and then they made a video and I tore that to pieces as well. Again, everyone's links in the description. Now, the reason that I was able to tear them apart from their marketing was because they didn't use FIR filters. They used minimum phase filters. They used IIR filters. And what that meant was that there was a big phase shift all the way up to 5K. And that was the reason why when you matched the curves with the standard digital EQ and Kit's Motown EQ, there was a difference in high end and you could hear it and you could see it in the null. And the null was showing you fucking there's a massive difference in high end, an audible difference in high end. So the quality of the filtering is very important, because if you look at something like Kit, it's an absolute mess. They even put oversampling in it to try and mitigate the phase shift. And even still, it was still skewing the high-end phase. So even though Kit's Motown EQ was a completely linear plugin, had no audible harmonic distortion or noise, just its poorly implemented anti-aliasing filter or its internal oversampling was enough to change the sound of the plugin. So even just in the high end of EQ plugins, due to digital limitations, EQ plugins can sound audibly different. And as much as the filters can be recreated, one thing I will say is very, very important is that cue behaviour is something, in my opinion, that does give a EQ a sound. So as much as, I'll slate Kit plugins, what I do like about the Motown EQ itself, and I like about API EQs, is that they have a proportional cue. And again, I've got videos in the description. I've covered all of this. Like, I'm tired you can see I'm bored going on about it. What a proportional cue does is it starts off with a very wide cue, and then it gets narrow and narrow and narrow the more that you boost. So when you're actually using, say, an API or the Motown EQ, in real time, you're getting a different sound than you would if you were just to get a fixed cue with, say, FabFilter Pro Q3 and boost it up and down. Yes, once it's all said and done, yes, I could get the same results with FabFilter Pro Q3 or a standard digital DAW EQ. However, it's the real-time change of the cue that allows me to find the sweet spot. And I would say that that's something that is important to talk about, because yeah, it's all fine and well being able to fucking recreate something after it's been done, But being able to get that in real time is different. I made my own Motown EQ via MAAG just to spite KIRCHHOFF plugins, to the point where I coded, well, me and Emre Celik coded the proportional Q exact, where we got a null up, down. So we actually like automated both to automate up and down, just to prove that like we could genuinely get it to null and it was completely linear. And that Q behaviour is why in like real life practice, like actually using the EQ, it will sound different boosting compared to, say, a FabFilter EQ. And also, as I'm doing this off the top of the dome, another thing that we'll go back to the Hitsville EQ from UAD. There's a parallel topology going on. That's another thing you need to watch out for. I've got a parallel EQ through there. Bart Hurk made an analog parallel EQ. Basically, and long story short, right, when you use like a FabFilter EQ and you say like you boost or cut 3 or 4 different things, they all work in series. And if you think about like an analog circuit, it's all one stage and they all kind of go into each other because it's one stage. But in a parallel filter design, something like, say, acoustic clariphonic, they all are separate filters and they all meet at the end. So essentially all these filters are separate and then summed together. And what that does is it gives you kind of minimal band interaction. So say like if you boost 200 Hertz and you boost 600 Hertz, see that middle band interaction? It's limited by using a parallel filter topology. So when you're using the UAD Hitsville, you're going to get a different sound, especially if you're kind of boosting kind of quite close frequencies, you're boosting kind of close octaves. Honestly, I tried to like recreate it in MXXX and I was having a bit of a hard time with it to get it absolutely bang on. Because as soon as I knew it was a parallel filter, I was like, oh my god, these are all going to have to be properly separate filters and stuff. And I just couldn't be bothered at that point, because I got to the point where I was like, right, I've proved that like the kit MOQ, that doesn't even have the minimal band interaction as well. Like it's just a proper stock digital EQ. And I was like, oh, I could try and recreate the UAD Hitsville and try and get the parallel filters in, and I just couldn't be I couldn't be bothered. But again, it's another thing that makes an EQ plugin sound different from the other. And by the way, right, I'm just going to put it out there, right? I spent ages on this one particular video, weeks on it. It's like a 22-minute video. It's one of the best videos I've ever made. And I'll leave a link in the description. Paul from AP Mastering, watch that. You will learn a lot, and trust me, your tests will be way, way, way better. When it comes to like the test signal to use, if it's a non-linear plugin, don't use white noise, right? Long story short, again, watch the video, but white noise has no relevance to acoustic sound. When you are feeding a signal into that non-linear process, you need to feed it, for realistic results and a realistic null, you need to feed it a signal that replicates acoustic sound, because that is what we use in music. We never ever ever use anything that's white noise. Now he made a comment saying that white noise is effectively the most complex signal because it's just like lots of random noise. White noise is equal energy per frequency, so every single frequency is at the exact same energy. However, there is no acoustic sound that you're going to use in music that's going to be able to replicate that, which is why I always advise, when it comes to like doing differences and null tests, to always use pink noise. Essentially, there is no acoustic sound that is going to be able to give you a bigger null than pink noise when both of them have the exact same maximum frequency peak. White noise is equal energy per frequency. Pink noise is white noise but tilted in a way that results in equal energy per octave, which is how acoustic sound works. We work in octaves, which means you're going to have a lot of low end energy and less energy in the highs. So when you feed a non-linear process and you're trying to like figure out the audible differences of things, you need to feed it a source that's going to have lots of low end energy and less energy in the highs. Then what you could do is you could then measure that null, and then you're going to be able to see the realistic maximum differences that are actually in the plugins. And also when you're doing nulls, right, always remember that like your master DAW fader, or just like your level meter in your DAW, whether it be a track or a channel or a master, that has a limit of how much dB it actually shows. So you can essentially kind of falsify. I'm not saying this Paul guy has done that, but Kit tried to do that. What Kit did was they tried to do their own null on a piano. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was a difference in the phase due to the minimum phase filters that were poorly implemented. So there was a massive difference from 5k upwards. What they did was they took an acoustic, I'm not joking, there'll be a link in the description. They took a piano, rolled off all the high end after 5k, then did a null test. But what they did was they brought the master fader down by minus, I think it was minus 13.5 dB or something like that. You bring the level down, oh, guess what? The level of the meter comes down as well. In these white noise null tests, right? This guy was basically like taking all these EQs and curve matching them as best as he could and trying to get the phase right, blah, 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 using Bertram Curve Analyzer, which is a free curve analyzer. I personally suggest using plugindoctor because there's a fundamental sweep which caters for non-linearities. Remember, if you are dealing with any plugin that has audible non-linearities, it will skew the results that you see in the linear test, which means it will skew the results that you will see in Bertram Curve Analyzer. And that's why it's always important to give exact kind of numerical values to everything that you do. Some DAW meters will only show up to like minus 60 dBFS. Some could be changed to show minus 30, minus 40. And trust me, like if it's set to like minus 30, minus 40, and it goes off the meter, there's still a lot of audible differences in there. What you can do to be even more precise, and this will help your message, Paul, what you can do is take your original signal, so you measure the original signal, and then what you do is you take the null, you add that on to your original signal, and then you measure the difference of the null. So for example, right, say like you've got drums, right? You've got the original drums and they're coming out to say, I don't know, minus 16 LUFS. So you do your null test, blah, 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 and you're left with the null. You take that printed null, you also send that to the master, and what you do is you measure how much level that difference is added to that original signal. And from there, you're going to be able to give a numerical value of how much dB value is added in regards to difference. When I was crucifying the Waves BB tubes, good times, good times, I was able to show that like some of their presets were adding differences of like 0.6 dB. That was all the difference actually equated to 0.6 dB. And you know, there's a certain article, Sim Dum One, where they were saying that most people struggle to hear a dB of difference. And again, sometimes for some people it takes like maybe 2 to 3 dB of difference to actually hear it in the context of something. And again, you add that into the context of a mix, everything just gets swamped. And the difficulty that you've got, that obviously that brings in, you know, some subjectivity into the mix, because some people again might have, you know, golden ears, some people might be better at critical listening than others. Again, many people have said to me that I've got kind of crazy listening, but I don't know, I don't think it's any different to anybody else. But you get some people that can hear very subtle differences, you know, compared to other people. But I'd say things like half a dB is nothing to worry about. But why that's important is that having a numerical value takes out your own subjectivity, because you might sit there and go, I can't hear it, there's no difference. And if I can't hear it, then you don't need to have this fucking EQ plugin or this saturator or whatever it is. Some other person that's maybe a bit more experienced, maybe might have a more tuned ear, might hear it. So having that numerical value, using things like span and like showing numerical values over the frequency spectrum so you can see where the differences actually are, instead of just having a fucking 2-channel fucking master fader that's just showing you an overall dB value, that's not helping anybody. Because what you've got to remember, and what that video that I've got linked down below shows, is that there might not be any differences from say like 400 to fucking 20k, but you know, it might be a transformer based plugin, and again it's shifting the phase a lot, and then all of a sudden like you go into it hard, and then all of a sudden it's like, wow, there's like the overall level isn't that much, but I could hear it in the low end. And that's why it's important to go deeper. That's why it's important to look at the entire frequency spectrum and to have a numerical value for everything. Because even if we just think about a non-linear process, right, an analog EQ, if we think about a lot of, even some of the Waves ones, a lot of them have modelled the clipping stage. A lot of vintage EQs didn't have a lot of headroom. Now, headroom is very important in analog. Now, in analog, your headroom is how much input you could feed into that unit until it starts to clip. Now, in analog, you don't get a hard clip like in digital. You'll normally get a soft clip, especially when you're dealing with like, you know, input and output transformers, and especially if you think about like Neve stuff and like really old vintage coloured stuff. There is a level where you hit it hard enough it'll start to clip and it'll start to give you that kind of soft knee. In a linear plugin, you don't need to gain stage it because it's linear. In a non-linear plugin, if it's modeled correctly, they will calibrate 0 VU to a set dB full scale level. Normally it's like -18, sometimes it's -15. But say if we say 0 VU in the plugin is -18 dB full scale. So for example, let's use the Hitsville EQ for example. Now I showed there was analog clipping in there. There was a clipping stage that they'd implemented. So there was a certain level in the Hitsville EQ where if you put enough input level into it, it would start to clip. Now waves are the same. I think they call it input sensitivity. It's essentially just bringing your headroom down, like your ceiling down, to where it starts to soft clip in that soft knee. And it gets to a point where it exceeds and then fuck it, it'll just like distort and clip. So like a linear digital EQ will clip based on the DAW. So as soon as it hits fucking 0 dBFS, it clips. Where in the plugin, 0 dBFS has been brought down to a certain level, which means that you're having to gain stage the plugin like you would an analog. And when a plugin has correctly modeled, say like the input transformer stage, it's going to react differently to its input. So you'll get more that kind of more low end kind of color and say like the 20, 30, 40 hertz range, the harder you go into it. But you won't get that with a standard, linear digital EQ. And to be honest, you won't get it with some other analog emulations because they've either not modeled the transformer circuit or they've not modeled the non-linearities, or it's just an analog unit that's got a shit ton of headroom and has been made to be, very transparent, like your MAAGs, like your better makers. Right, so hopefully, right, after all that, and hopefully after you've watched all of the fucking videos that I've made over the years, that we can agree that EQ plugins do sound different. It just depends on the EQ plugin. Now, there's one last thing, however, that I want to mention. Now, I was going to make a video about this separately because it's something that I've been leaning more into. Many people think it's like the filters and the curves and it's the saturation, it's the clipping, when actually the actual sound of like most analog EQs, it is its internal phase. Now, when it comes to talking about like internal phase, what I mean by internal phase is the phase just of the pass-through of the signal running through the circuitry. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer, I don't make fucking analog units, but one thing that I have picked up over the years speaking to people that do is that input transformers normally tend to change the phase primarily in the low end and in the high end. Now, when I was speaking to Bart Herc, who's got quite a lot of 500 series stuff through there, he was telling me that the transformer bump is actually a fault. It's basically a fault in the circuit that people loved because they love just that little bit of richness in the lows, the little bit of like low bump that you get, and again the phase shift that occurs as well. It's a fault at the end of the day because a transformer is just meant to be, act as linear as possible. It's not really meant to give you a low frequency bump, but some circuits did and many people loved it. But again, that's got its own inherent phase response, and that's why when I tried to match Ruby, Acustica Ruby, and I tried to match the titanium, which is the Pultec, I just couldn't do it because the pass-through of the unit was just too hard to replicate. And when I did try and replicate it and try and get the phase right, it was just really difficult because the thing with algorithmic plugins is normally they are limited to say 20 hertz, 20 kilohertz, where in some of these analog units you get like low-end roll-offs as much as like 5-10 hertz. You can see it in plugindoctor. And the great thing with convolution is that it's been able to take a snapshot of that, where I imagine to code that pass-through must be a little bit of a nightmare to try and get the phase right, blah, 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 where convolution's easy because it can take a snapshot. And that is the main reason why I still use Acustica plugins to this day. Not for the filters, because I could do the filters with a normal EQ. I just want the pass-through. But it's not just input transformers, it's also the line amp. The line amp is the thing. Now in Acustica plugins, they call it the pre. I don't know why, because it's a post amp, it's a line amp. The line amp goes at the end. So you'll have your input transformer, you'll have your filter circuit, and then your filter circuit goes into like a line amp. And then sometimes if it's Neve, like an output transformer. So your input transformer is going to shift the phase, your output transformer is going to shift the phase, dependent on the circuit, dependent on the transformers, dependent on how good you are, you know, as a circuit designer, blah, blah, blah. But the line amp, you know, in a lot of old vintage gears was the thing that caused the tone of the box. Now, when I spoke to a few like analog circuit designers, they told me that input transformers are kind of more kind of low and high end based in terms of like how they change the frequency response. Where with a line amp, the line amp kind of works from fucking, you know, 10 hertz all the way up to like, you know, 20 kilohertz. And that can essentially alter the phase, you know, wideband of the whole frequency spectrum. And, you know, when you go through the acustica pre's, you'll notice that. And that's what I've been using a lot more of. I was working on a track, a Mark Daniel Nelson production, and I just couldn't get the low end right. And I was like, I don't really want to EQ it because I'm losing something. I'm either losing or gaining. And I was like, he's got the low end to sit back. I could hear it. It's got this blooming effect. And I was like, I used to get that from Brown, which the Acustica Brown is modelling, I can't remember. But I used it on the acoustic guitars, the bass guitar, and the piano because it was quite a low pad thing. And the low end just bloomed. And the reason that it sat back and it bloomed was because, one, it was introducing kind of subtle harmonics in the low end, but the phase response of the specific pre or line amp that I chose had its own frequency response and adapted the phase in a way in the low end that just made it sit back. And that's why people like Dan Worrell will always tell you to not fear the phase shift, because phase shift can be handy, but sometimes playing about with the phase can impact the stereo image. Sometimes you can manipulate the phase to get something to sit back. If we think about what the depth function in stage 1 is doing, it's manipulating early reflections, so it's manipulating timing. So if you think about a analog box that's got phase discrepancies from like fucking, you know, 10 to fucking 20 kilohertz all the way up, what you're going to hear is kind of timing issues. You're going to hear like these subtle EQ moves, because essentially that's what phase is. Dan Worrell made a great point a couple of months ago where EQ doesn't cause phase shift causes EQ. So as many people would see the pre as like, it's the pass through the amp. It's not EQ. It is EQ. It's inbuilt EQ that you've got no control of. But that inbuilt EQ and the phase response of it has a sound and a tone that can give you something that other EQs will just not give you. Like I used the amber, I can't remember which one it is. I think it's pre-2, or it's the line amp of the compressor, not the newest amber, which is the Avalon Amber 3. And I used to use that because I knew there was discrepancy in left and right. So not only was there like a bit of a phase shift, there was a discrepancy in left and right. And for anybody that doesn't know, when you have a discrepancy in left and right, that means that you've got more of a side signal. So I was getting a little bit of width, and it was just doing something. It was just to kind of add a bit of width, but set the source back a little bit. And I've got to the point now where I'm not using the acustica EQs. I'm just using the post amp. But like, I suppose I am using an EQ because they are still an EQ. They're shifting the phase, so they're EQing. But it's very subtle. And again, you could just kind of raise the input gain and sometimes have that balance and that control of your harmonic distortion. And it's that kind of way of playing about with the non-linearities that for me can be the difference of getting a track that sounds overly processed to a track that you give back to their client and they go, wow, like this sounds like my track, but you've genuinely just made it 5 to 10% better. That was something when I was sitting down with MSM in London, and there was all these wee things. He was just like, I'm just going to pass it through that. No, it's not working. Pass it through that. Listen to that tiny little move there, and then he'd A-B with a rough, and I'd be like, it's a little bit harsher there, and yes, it's a little bit forward, but then now that sits a little bit back. And then when I was playing about with the Mark Daniel Nelson track, which is great, and we do an Atmos mix of it as well, just using the line amp, the custom line amp on one of the Brown fucking post amps, it just worked, and it gave me a little bit of richness in the lows, a little bit of a bloom, and because of the phase discrepancies, it allowed me to play about with that front and back. If you really want to get into the sound of EQs, get into Acustica, or get into Nebula, and get into guys like Tim Petherick and other people, or just get into convolution. Start like finding people that have got analog gear and start taking IRs and stuff like that. Like Emre Çelik has an IR of his LA2A in vocal shaper and kick shaper just because of that front to back depth, that 3D thing people talk about. Even microphones do it. This microphone I'm speaking through right now is the JZ V12, which is their take on like the C12. And it's got its own frequency response, right, which is obviously manipulating phase. And it's just got this depth to it. You get some microphones, again, think about polar patterns as well. It's all playing about with phase. And through the JZ Black Hole 2, super cardioid, and you get this really directional upfront sound, where with this, it's open and things sit back a little bit. If I record acoustic guitar with that, I get a different sound with it, whether I use the OC818 or I use the JZ Black Hole 2 or I use the Loughton Atlantis. Acustica Taupe is quite good as well. That's just basically all the tape. They sampled a shit ton of tapes and they have their own sound. They have their own harmonic characteristic, their own non-linearities, their own clipping points, their own forms of compression. But again, their own pass-through. Even just the pass-through of that and the way the phase emulates, it's all a cacophony of wrongness. But it's that wrongness of analog that many people like. And that's why Acustica still have a little soft spot in my heart. As much as I get pissed off with their new plugins, as much as I get pissed off that they couldn't do compression right for so long because they had to do it manually. Now they're talking about hypertech and I'm like, fuck, this is what Tim Petherick was basically doing fucking 10 years ago, and you're still not as good as Tim Petherick. But they're getting better. It's getting better. But, you know, in terms of just the pre's, having that plethora of tonal options is something that you should get into, something that you should experiment with, and realise it is subtle. And in most cases, you are just going to need a stock digital EQ. Just if you need an 8K boost, just boost 8K, right? But if you need something subtle, then again, you can use certain EQs for their sound, because there is a sound. And that there, hopefully, in this hodgepodge video that I've done off the top of my head, has kind of given you the realistic, audible differences of EQs. Some EQs, yes, are marketing bollocks. And again, I've shown it many times that you don't need them. They're normally fixed kind of cue points, fixed frequencies. They're easy to emulate. They're not going to give you anything different. If you need an 8K boost, just fucking go with the stock digital EQ. But there are reasons why certain EQ plugins will sound different from each other. Blah, 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 blah. Just go on with the rest of your day and fucking mix, right? Stop over-analysing these things. Stop buying so many fucking plugins. And yes, I can't stop fucking speaking. Okay, I'm done. Right, see you later. Right, fuck, I can't get past this. Right, okay. Oh, come on, fuck it. Right, I'm done. See you later.